What if I told you there's a single species in the galaxy that doesn't understand the concept of surrender? Not because they're stronger, not because they're smarter, but because they simply refuse to stop. In a universe where every civilization follows strict rules of war to survive, one species ignored all of them. And that was the moment everything broke. Because the rules only work if everyone agrees to follow them, and humanity never did. In the galaxy, war was not chaos. It was structure, predictable, contained, controlled. Every civilization that had survived long enough eventually reached the same conclusion. Total war meant total extinction. And so, they created rules, not out of mercy, but out of necessity. They called it the Concord of War, a binding agreement between thousands of species across thousands of star systems. 3 absolute laws: no exceptions, no interpretation, no deviation. Do not target civilian populations. Do not destroy planetary bodies. Do not deploy weapons of indiscriminate annihilation. These were not moral guidelines. They were survival protocols. Because every species understood one truth: if even one civilization ignored them, the rest would be forced to follow. And then everything would end. For millennia, the Concord held. Wars were fought, fleets were destroyed, empires rose and fell. But the damage was always limited, always contained, until humanity was discovered. The planet was unremarkable at first glance, a mid-sized world orbiting an average star in a quiet sector of the outer spiral. Its inhabitants were classified quickly: early industrial transitioning into digital age, fragmented governance, inefficient resource distribution, no unified planetary command. A low-tier civilization, not a threat. Not yet. Designation? The survey officer asked. The answer came without hesitation. Species: human. Status: pre-Concord. Risk level: minimal. Captain Tharic of the monitoring vessel Kethril observed the blue world in silence. He had seen dozens like it before. Young species always followed similar paths: conflict, expansion, stabilization, then eventual integration into the Concord. It was a pattern as reliable as gravity. Initiate first contact protocol, he ordered. Transmit the Concord parameters. The signal was sent, encoded in universal constants, mathematics, physics, patterns no intelligent species could misinterpret. It carried no threat, no demand, only information and a warning. This is how war is fought. This is how you survive. The response came slower than expected, fragmented, inconsistent, not unified. Multiple transmissions, different languages, conflicting tones. Some demanded identification. Some expressed fear. Others dismissed it entirely. They are not coordinated, the communications officer noted. No central authority. Tharic nodded. Expected. Primitive species often lacked unity. That would change in time. It always did. Clarify transmission, he said. Reiterate Concord laws. The second message was sent. Simpler, direct. 3 rules, absolute. The reply this time was clearer. A single transmission, likely from one of the dominant planetary factions. It was brief. We do not understand your authority to impose these terms. Silence followed. On the bridge, several officers exchanged glances. Not confusion, concern. They are rejecting the Concord, the analyst said. Incorrect, Tharic replied calmly. They are failing to comprehend it. There was a difference. One could be corrected. The other was dangerous. Do they acknowledge the consequences? The officer asked. They do not believe there are consequences, Theric said, because from their perspective, there weren't. Not yet. Then we demonstrate, the weapons officer said. It was not aggression. It was protocol. Limited engagement. Controlled damage. A lesson. Target selection? Military infrastructure only, Theric answered immediately. No civilian zones. No planetary destabilization. The Concord was not just a rule book. It was identity. Even in teaching war, they obeyed it. The fleet moved into position, precise, calculated. A single strike group descending into the planet's orbital layer, targeting isolated military installations across multiple regions. Simultaneous impact. Minimal collateral. Maximum clarity. The strikes landed. Human defenses responded. Slow, disorganized, ineffective. Their systems were not designed for orbital warfare. Not yet. Within minutes, key installations were neutralized. Communication hubs disrupted. Defensive networks crippled. Damage assessment, Theric asked. Military capacity reduced by 40%, the system reported. Civilian impact negligible. Perfect. Contained. Exactly as the Concord intended. Theric watched the planet below, waiting for the next step in the pattern. Surrender, negotiation, compliance. That was how it always went. Always. Incoming transmissions, the communications officer said. Multiple sources. Theric allowed it. Play them. The audio filled the bridge, not unified, not controlled, but louder now, urgent, emotional. We're under attack, unknown hostile. All forces mobilize. Repeat, all forces. Who are they? What do they want? This isn't a demonstration. This is war. Theric frowned slightly. That wasn't the expected response. Filter for command-level communication, he ordered. The system complied, isolating higher priority signals. A new voice emerged, steady, focused. All units, this is not a drill. Unknown extraterrestrial force has engaged. Full defensive posture authorized. A pause. Then the words that shifted everything. This is a global threat. Global, not regional, not limited. Total. Theric's gaze sharpened. They are escalating incorrectly, the analyst said. They are treating a limited strike as full invasion. Clarify intent, Theric ordered immediately. Transmit. Engagement is restricted. Compliance will prevent further action. The message was sent. Clear, direct, final. This can stop. You only need to follow the rules. The response came faster this time. Not confusion, not hesitation. A single transmission broadcast across the entire planet. We don't know what rules you think this is. A beat. But you just attacked us. Silence. Then, we respond. The signal cut. On the bridge, no one spoke for a moment, because something had just broken. Not physically, not yet, but in the pattern. They didn't ask for terms, the communications officer said quietly. They didn't request negotiation. They didn't acknowledge the conquered, the analyst added. Theric remained still, watching the planet below as activity surged across its surface. Launch signatures, energy spikes, communication networks igniting in chaotic synchronization. Not organized, not efficient, but fast. They're mobilizing everything, the sensor officer said. Not just military assets. Theric felt it then. Not fear, not yet, but something unfamiliar. Something that did not fit within the structure he had trusted for his entire career. They don't understand the rules, the navigation officer said. Theric shook his head slowly. His eyes remained fixed on the growing storm below. No, he said quietly. And for the first time, Uncertainty entered his voice. They do. A pause. The data continued to rise, signals multiplying, systems activating, the entire planet responding. They just don't accept them. And in that moment, for the first time in thousands of years, the rules of war stopped meaning anything at all. They had seen this before, or at least, they thought they had. Primitive species always reacted with fear when first exposed to superior force. They panicked, overcommitted, misread intent. Then, once the demonstration was complete, they adapted, they learned, they accepted the rules. That was how it always worked. Captain Therick stood at the center of the Kethro Bridge, watching the flood of human activity surge across the planet below. Launch signatures multiplied, communication networks saturated, military assets mobilized at a scale far exceeding the damage inflicted. It was inefficient, excessive, temporary. They are overreacting, the tactical analyst stated. Their response exceeds necessary parameters for a limited engagement. Therick nodded once. Expected. Fear distorted perception. It always had. Continue observation, he ordered. Do not escalate. The Concorde required restraint, even when the opponent did not yet understand it. Incoming projectiles, the sensor officer reported. The projection shifted. Dozens of trajectories rising from the surface, crude, uncoordinated, but aimed. Interception? The weapons officer asked. Therick didn't hesitate. Minimal defense only. Demonstrate superiority, not annihilation. The ship's systems responded instantly. Point defense arrays activated, neutralizing incoming threats with precision. Each projectile destroyed before it could reach effective range. Clean, controlled, effortless. All hostiles neutralized, the system confirmed. Therick watched the aftermath, waiting for the pattern to correct itself. This was the moment where most species recalibrated, where they realized resistance was ineffective and began seeking terms. But the human response didn't slow. It intensified. Additional launches detected, the sensor officer said. Higher volume, increased velocity. Therick's gaze narrowed slightly. They are repeating failure, the analyst noted. Without adjustment, that wasn't entirely accurate. Therick could see subtle changes, angles shifting, propulsion improving, timing tightening. Not enough to matter, but enough to notice. They're learning, the navigation officer said quietly. Incrementally. Too slowly to be relevant, the analyst countered. Not in this phase, Therick said, because there wasn't supposed to be a next phase of resistance. Not at this level. Not after a demonstration like that. Transmit clarification again, he ordered. Emphasize limited scope. Offer cessation upon compliance. The signal was sent, clear, structured, final. This is not total war. It does not have to become total war. The reply came almost instantly. Not fragmented this time, not confused, focused, direct. You attacked our military infrastructure across multiple regions simultaneously. A pause. That is war. Therick felt something tighten, not in the ship, not in the data, but in the interpretation. Incorrect, he said calmly, even as he issued the response. This is a limited enforcement action under the Concord of War. Civilian populations remain unharmed. Planetary integrity preserved. Conflict can end immediately. Silence. Then the reply. You think that matters? The words lingered longer than they should have, because they didn't fit. Not within the structure, not within the logic. They are rejecting the premise, the analyst said. They are not distinguishing between limited and total conflict. Therick didn't respond immediately, because the data below was shifting again. Not just military movement, civilian infrastructure activating, Industrial output increasing. Communication networks expanding beyond military channels. They're mobilizing everything, the sensor officer said, not just armed forces. That was wrong. Fundamentally wrong. That violates the Concord, the analyst said. Civilian sectors are not to be integrated into active war zones. They are not bound by the Concord, Therick replied. The words felt heavier than they should have, because they carried a consequence no one had needed to consider in a very long time. Then they will collapse under inefficiency, the navigation officer said. Civilian integration creates instability. Yes, the analyst agreed. Their system will fail before it becomes effective. That was the expectation. It was also the assumption. And assumptions were beginning to break. New transmission, the communications officer said. Global broadcast. Therick turned. Play it. The voice that came through was different from before. Not fragmented, not reactive. Measured, controlled, but carrying something beneath it. Not fear, not confusion. Resolve. All nations are now under unified emergency command structure. A pause. This is a planetary-level conflict. Another pause. We are at war. Silence followed. Absolute. The bridge didn't react immediately, because the words themselves weren't the problem. It was what they implied. Unified command? The analyst said slowly. That was not present in earlier scans. It is now, Therick replied. And it had formed, instantly, under pressure, without the gradual consolidation every other species required. They've removed internal division, the navigation officer said, in response to external threat. Temporarily, the analyst added quickly. It will fracture once pressure is reduced. Therick didn't answer, because pressure wasn't being reduced. Energy output increasing across industrial sectors, the sensor officer reported. Resource allocation shifting toward production. Production of what? Therick asked. The system processed. Everything. That was not a valid answer, and yet it was accurate. Weapons, vehicles, infrastructure, communications, all scaling at once. No prioritization, no optimization, just increase. They're not selecting efficient paths, the analyst said. They're expanding all paths. That wasn't strategy. That was saturation. They're compensating for uncertainty, Therick said quietly, by removing it. Because if every option was pursued, none were excluded. Incoming projectiles, the sensor officer said again. More this time, faster, slightly more coordinated. Still ineffective, still easily intercepted, but not stopping. Never stopping. They continue to engage despite total failure, the analyst said. They are not adapting at a meaningful rate. Therick didn't respond. He was watching something else. The time between launches, the delay between detection and response. The curve. It wasn't linear. It was tightening. They don't need to succeed, he said quietly. They just need to continue. The words settled into the room with the weight no one challenged, because the data supported it. Failure wasn't slowing them down. It wasn't even delaying them. It was part of the process, integrated, immediate. Captain, the navigation officer said, voice more cautious now. At this rate, their total output will exceed projected limits within. It already has, Therick interrupted, because projections were based on systems that paused, systems that recalibrated, systems that required time to adapt. This species didn't. Then we escalate, the weapons officer said. Increase pressure, force compliance. Therick considered it. It was the logical step. Within the conquered, within the structure. Increase force, maintain limits, compel surrender. That was how controlled war functioned. That was how it always worked. He gave the order. Second strike group, same parameters. Military targets only. Increase impact. The fleet moved again. Precise. Calculated. A second wave descending toward the planet, targeting deeper infrastructure, more critical systems, still avoiding civilian zones, still preserving planetary stability. The strikes landed. Harder this time, more destructive. Military capacity dropped further, command centers disrupted, defense networks fractured. Damage assessment? Theric asked. Military capability reduced to 30%, the system replied. Civilian impact remains minimal. Perfect. Contained. Controlled. This should end it. It always did. Incoming transmission, the communications officer said. Theric nodded. Play it. The voice returned. The same one as before, but different now. Not just resolve. Something sharper. You're still holding back. The bridge went still. Because that was not the expected response. You're trying to limit this. A pause. We're not. The signal cut. No escalation in tone, no threat, just statement. Theric stared at the projection as activity below surged again, faster now, more coordinated, more focused. Not efficient, not controlled, but accelerating. They understand, the analyst said quietly. They see the limitations we're imposing. Yes, Theric said. His voice was calm, but something beneath it had shifted, and they've decided not to follow them. The data continued to rise. Signals, launches, production, all increasing. No pause, no hesitation, no sign of slowing. Controlled war required two sides to agree to control. For the first time in recorded history, only one side did, and that meant it wasn't controlled anymore. The third wave was never supposed to exist. In every recorded conflict under the Concord, escalation followed a predictable curve. Demonstration, resistance, adjustment, then compliance. Even the most stubborn civilizations eventually recognized the boundaries. They adapted to them. They survived because of them. Humanity did not adjust. They accelerated. Global activity has increased by 312% since the second strike, the sensor officer reported. Voice tight now, no longer neutral. Industrial output continues to rise across all sectors. Theric didn't look away from the projection. He didn't need to. The pattern was already clear. Break it down, he said. Where are they focusing? A pause, then everywhere. That answer again. Still unacceptable. Still correct. They are not optimizing, the analyst added. No prioritization of military over civilian production. There is no distinction anymore, Theric said quietly. That was the first real shift. The Concord existed on the premise that war could be separated, that violence could be contained within defined boundaries. Military targets, strategic assets. Everything else, untouched. Humanity had erased that separation entirely. Not out of cruelty, not out of strategy, because to them, it didn't exist. Incoming launches, the sensor officer said. This time, the projection filled with trajectories, hundreds of them, rising from every continent, every ocean, every location capable of producing or launching anything that could reach orbit. They weren't synchronized, they weren't clean, but they were constant. Intercept patterns holding, the weapons officer confirmed. All threats neutralized before effective range. The ship's defenses moved with flawless precision, cutting down wave after wave of human projectiles. It should have been decisive. It should have broken their momentum. It didn't. They're increasing volume faster than interception efficiency, the analyst said. Not enough to overwhelm us, the weapons officer replied. Not yet. That word hung there longer than anyone liked.
Tharek focused on the timing again. The intervals between launches. The delay between detection and response. It was shrinking, not smoothly, but aggressively.
"They're reducing reaction time," he said, "by removing processing phases."
The analyst frowned. Explain?
"They're not waiting to confirm results," Tharek said. "They're launching based on intent, not outcome."
That was wrong.
Fundamentally wrong. Every system in the galaxy relied on feedback loops. Observe, analyze, adapt. Humanity was skipping steps. That creates inefficiency, the analyst said. It should slow them down. Tharek didn't answer immediately, because the data said otherwise. It removes delay, he said finally. And in war, delay was everything.
"Captain," the communications officer said. "Incoming transmission from surface. Priority channel."
Tharek gestured. "Play it." The voice returned. The same one. Steady, controlled, but now colder. "We've analyzed your attack patterns." A pause. "You're avoiding civilian targets." Another pause. "You're limiting collateral damage." Silence stretched across the bridge.
"Because those weren't assumptions. They were observations, accurate ones. That means you're holding back." The statement landed heavier than any weapon.
"We're not." The signal cut. No threat, no escalation, just clarity. "They've identified the constraint," the analyst said. "They're using it to predict our behavior." "All species do that," the navigation officer replied. "That's standard tactical analysis." "Yes," Tharek said quietly, "but they're not adjusting to it." The projection shifted again. Not just launches, movement. Massive relocation of resources across the planet, transport networks overloaded, energy grids pushed beyond stable limits, entire regions converting infrastructure into production lines.
"They're cannibalizing their own systems," the analyst said, "redirecting everything into war output. That will collapse their internal stability," the navigation officer added. "Short term," Tharek said, "because the long term no longer mattered." "They don't need stability," he continued. "They need momentum." And momentum was building. Fast. "Captain," the sensor officer said,
"New signatures detected." Tharek's attention snapped to the display. Not surface launches this time. Orbital. Improvised platforms, structures that hadn't been there hours ago, now assembling in low orbit, crude but functional. "They're building in space," the analyst said, "with no established infrastructure." "They are creating it," Tharek replied. Because waiting to build infrastructure before using it required time. Time they had decided not to spend. "Weapon systems online," the sensor officer confirmed. "Low power, high instability." "They won't be effective," the weapons officer said. "They don't need to be," Tharek said again, because effectiveness was not the metric. Continuation was. The orbital platforms fired. Energy bursts, kinetic strikes, experimental weapons. Most failed before reaching target. Some detonated prematurely. Others dispersed into nothing. A few made it through. Not enough to damage the ship, but enough to register. Enough to matter. Minimal impact, the system reported. Hull integrity unaffected. But the number was not zero, and that was new. "They're improving," the analyst said. "Marginally. Continuously," Tharek corrected, because there was no pause between attempts, no reset. Each failure fed directly into the next launch. "They're learning faster than we can model," the navigation officer said. That wasn't possible. And yet, it was happening. "Initiate third strike," the weapons officer said. "Increase pressure, Force collapse. Theric considered it.
The logic was sound. Apply more force. Break the system. End the conflict. But something in the data resisted that conclusion. If we escalate, he said slowly, they will escalate. They already are, the analyst replied. Not like this, Theric said. Because so far, humanity had been reacting, fast, aggressive, but still reactive. A true escalation from them would not be limited by anything, not by doctrine, not by restraint, not by the Concord. Captain, the communications officer said again, new transmission. Theric nodded. Play it. The voice returned, and this time, there was no attempt at explanation, no attempt at understanding. Just a statement. You think this is controlled? A pause. You think this stops? Another pause. Longer this time. It doesn't. Silence. Then the final line. This is what war is. The signal ended. No follow-up, no demand. Just truth as they understood it. The bridge remained still because something had just shifted again. Not in the battle, in the definition. They're not fighting within the Concord, the analyst said quietly. They're not fighting against it, Theric replied. His eyes remained fixed on the planet below, on the endless motion, the continuous output, the complete absence of pause. They're fighting outside it, and outside the Concord, there were no rules. The projection surged again, more launches, more platforms, more activity, all increasing, all accelerating, all refusing to slow. Controlled war required limits. Humanity had none, and for the first time in thousands of years, the galaxy was about to remember what war looked like without them. The third strike group did not launch immediately. That alone was enough to break protocol. Under the Concord, hesitation was not part of escalation. Decisions were calculated, executed, and resolved within predictable parameters. But nothing about this conflict remained predictable. They're accelerating again, the sensor officer said, voice no longer neutral, no longer distant. Surface output has doubled since last cycle. Orbital platforms increasing in both number and variation. Variation. That word mattered now more than volume. Theric watched as the projection filled with human constructs, none identical, none standardized, each built with different materials, different designs, different approaches to the same problem. Most were inefficient, many were unstable, some worked. They're not refining, the analyst said. They're diverging. They're exploring every possibility simultaneously, Theric corrected. Because refinement required time. Convergence required agreement. Humanity was doing neither. That will create inconsistency, the navigation officer said. Gaps in capability. It will create unpredictability, Theric replied. And unpredictability could not be modeled. Captain, the weapons officer said, recommend immediate escalation, third strike, increased impact. We must force compliance before their output reaches critical mass. The logic was sound. It was also incomplete. Theric didn't respond right away. Instead, he focused on the timing again, the intervals, the delays, the response curves. They were no longer just shrinking. They were collapsing. They're removing delay entirely, he said quietly. Their systems are beginning to operate without pause. That's impossible, the analyst replied. All systems require processing time. Ours do, Theric said. A beat. Theirs are adapting around it. The data confirmed it. Overlapping commands, parallel execution, failures not isolated, but absorbed mid-process, redirected instantly without stopping the overall system. It wasn't efficient, it wasn't stable, but it was continuous. If we don't escalate now, we lose control of the engagement, the weapons officer insisted. Tharek turned slightly. We lost control the moment they refused the premise. Silence followed, because that was the truth none of them wanted to say out loud. Incoming signal, the communications officer said. Not from surface.
Tharek's attention snapped back. Source? Orbital platforms. That was new. The projection shifted. Multiple human structures in orbit aligning, not perfectly, not cleanly, but intentionally. They're coordinating, the analyst said. Not through central command, through shared targeting data. Decentralized synchronization, Tharek said.
Each unit acting independently, but informed by the whole. That shouldn't work. It violated every principle of controlled warfare, and yet, it was. They're about to fire, the sensor officer warned. Brace for impact, the weapons officer asked. Tharek didn't answer immediately, because this wasn't just another wave.
The energy signatures were different, less stable, more volatile, but stronger.
Minimal defense, he said finally. Observe outcome. The platforms fired. Not in sequence, not in formation. All at once. A chaotic burst of energy, kinetic mass, experimental weaponry, most of it unstable, much of it failing before reaching target. But not all. This time, more made it through. Not enough to breach the hull. Not enough to cause structural damage, but enough to register across multiple systems simultaneously. Impact across outer layers, the system reported. Minor degradation detected. The bridge went still. Not because of the damage, because of the number. That exceeds previous engagement metrics, the analyst said quietly. They increased effectiveness by 18% in a single cycle. That wasn't possible under normal conditions, not without analysis, not without time. They didn't wait to confirm success, Tharek said. They improved during execution. That was the difference. Every other species learned between battles. Humanity learned during them.
Captain,
The navigation officer said, if this rate continues, their output will eventually exceed our defensive capacity. Eventually is irrelevant, the weapons officer replied. We can end this now. Tharek turned slightly. How? The question wasn't rhetorical. The answer came immediately. Full escalation. Target planetary infrastructure. Force total collapse. They will have no capacity to continue. Silence. Because that violated the Concord. Not partially, completely. That is not authorized, the analyst said. That would destabilize the planet. It would end the war, the weapons officer countered. Tharek didn't speak, because both statements were true, and for the first time, they were in conflict.
incoming transmission, the communications officer said again.
Surface origin. Tharek nodded once. Play it. The voice returned. No distortion, no hesitation. Clear, controlled. But something beneath it had changed. Not just resolve, recognition. We see it now. A pause. You have limits. Another pause. You won't cross them. Silence stretched across the bridge. Because that wasn't an assumption anymore. It was a confirmed variable. That means we can predict you. The analyst exhaled slowly. They're integrating our constraints into their model. All species do that, the navigation officer repeated. They use it to survive. No, Tharek said quietly. His eyes remained fixed on the projection, on the endless surge of activity that refused to slow.
They're using it to win.
The transmission continued. You think holding back makes you stronger. A beat. It doesn't. The final line came without emphasis, without emotion, just fact. It makes you slower. The signal cut. No escalation, no threat, just understanding. And that
was worse. "Captain," the weapons officer said more urgently now, "we must act."
If they continue to exploit our limitations,
"They will,"
Theric interrupted. Not as speculation, as certainty, because they already were. The projection surged again. More platforms, more launches, more variation, all increasing, all accelerating, all refusing to stabilize. "They've identified the gap," the analyst said, "between what we can do and what we won't do."
That gap had never mattered before, because no one had ever pushed against it. No one had ever needed to. "Prepare third strike," Theric said finally. The weapons officer moved immediately. "Target parameters?" There was a pause. Not long, but long enough to matter. "Military infrastructure," Theric said. The answer came automatically, instinctively. The Concorde still held. For them.
Confirmed, the weapons officer said. Third strike group moving into position.
The fleet shifted again, preparing another controlled, limited, precise engagement. But this time, it felt different. Not because the strike had changed, because everything else had. "Captain," the sensor officer said, voice quieter now, almost cautious, "human activity has not slowed." Theric didn't look away.
"It won't," he said.
Because slowing required limits, and they didn't have any. The third strike would land. It would damage them. It would reduce their capacity. It would follow every rule that had governed war for thousands of years. And it would not matter, because the rules only worked when both sides followed them. And humanity never had. The third strike descended with perfect precision.
It was everything the Concorde demanded,
Measured, controlled, devastating only where it was allowed to be. Military installations vanished in coordinated bursts of energy. Command networks fractured. Defensive grids collapsed in layers. No civilian zones touched. No planetary systems destabilized. Clean, efficient, contained.
"Damage assessment?" Theric asked, already knowing the pattern, already expecting the result.
"Military capability reduced to 18%, the system replied. "Operational cohesion disrupted. Civilian impact remains negligible." Perfect. This should have ended it. It always did. At this level of degradation, every known civilization had done the same thing. Withdrawn, recalculated, requested terms. War under the Concorde was never meant to reach this point without resolution. And yet, they're still accelerating, the sensor officer said. No hesitation now, no uncertainty, just fact. The projection confirmed it. Across the surface of the planet, activity surged again. Not in spite of the strike, but almost in response to it. Infrastructure shifted, rerouted, repurposed. What remained was not stabilizing, it was transforming. "They've lost central command nodes," the analyst said. "Coordination should degrade." It didn't. The pattern didn't fragment. It spread. Smaller networks took over. Independent systems continued without pause. Decentralization increased, the navigation officer noted. "They're compensating for structural loss." "They're not compensating," Theric said quietly. "They're adapting." Because compensation implied returning to a previous state. Humanity wasn't doing that. They were moving forward from whatever remained.
New orbital structures detected, the sensor officer added. More stable this time. Increased power output.
Theric focused on the projection. The platforms were different now. Not just variations, but iterations. Designs that had failed before, returning, altered. Systems that had collapsed, rebuilt with modifications. Not perfect, but better. "They're learning faster," the analyst said.
"Each cycle improves efficiency."
"Not efficiency," Theric corrected.
effectiveness. Because efficiency required optimization, effectiveness only required results. And their results were increasing. "Incoming fire," the weapons officer said. The next wave launched, not chaotic like before, not entirely controlled, but closer. Patterns emerging, timing tightening. More impacts reached the ship.
Still minimal, still survivable. But the number kept rising. Outer hull degradation at 3%, the system reported. Silence followed, because the number had changed again. "That exceeds safe engagement parameters," the analyst said. "We are no longer operating within standard risk margins." "We still have overwhelming superiority," the weapons officer replied.
"Then end it," the navigation officer said. The words came faster this time, sharper. "Full escalation. Target their industrial base. Collapse production." Tharek didn't answer immediately, because the solution was obvious and impossible. "That violates the Concord," the analyst said, almost automatically now, but the certainty in their voice was weakening.
"The Concord is already failing," the navigation officer shot back.
"They are not following it. We are losing because of it." Losing. The word had not been used before. Not here. Not against a species like this. "We are not losing," the weapons officer said firmly. "We are restraining." "And they are not," the navigation officer replied. Silence again. Heavier this time.
Because the difference between those two states was shrinking.
"Captain," the sensor officer said. "Incoming transmission, surface origin." Tharek nodded once. "Play it." The voice returned, clear, focused, but now something else had entered it. Not just understanding, not just resolve, calculation. "We've mapped your strike patterns." A pause. "We've mapped your targeting logic." Another pause. "We know what you won't hit." The bridge went completely still, because that was it. The variable, the constant, the limit. "So we're moving everything there."
The projection updated instantly. Massive shifts in infrastructure, production centers relocating into densely populated regions, military assets dispersing into civilian zones, supply lines rerouted through areas the Concord explicitly protected. "They're using civilian sectors as shields," the analyst said, voice tightening. "Not intentionally," Tharek said, because from their perspective, there was no distinction. Only resources, only continuation. "They are forcing us to choose," the navigation officer said. "Maintain the Concord or stop them." The transmission continued. "You can keep holding back." A beat. "We won't." The signal cut. No threat, no emotion, just a statement of fact. "Captain," the weapons officer said, urgency breaking through now. "We cannot allow this. If their production continues at this rate..." "It will," Tharek interrupted, because there was no scenario where it didn't. Not anymore. The projection surged again, more output, more movement, more adaptation, all accelerating, all feeding into itself. "They're removing our ability to act within the Concord," the analyst said. "They're collapsing the framework, not by attacking it, not by rejecting it, by making it irrelevant." "Then we abandon it," the navigation officer said. The words landed harder than anything else, because that had never happened. Not in recorded history. "If we cross that line," the analyst said slowly, "we trigger full-scale escalation across all observing civilizations." Because they were watching. They always were. The Concord wasn't just law, it was trust. Break it once, and it breaks everywhere. "If we don't," the navigation officer replied, "they will." Tharek stood in silence, watching the planet below. The endless motion, the constant output, the complete absence of pause. Humanity wasn't slowing. They weren't stabilizing. They weren't waiting. They were forcing the war into a state the Concorde was never designed to handle. A war without limits. A war without separation. A war without rules.
Captain, the system said quietly, human output has exceeded previous projections by 600%. The number didn't matter, not anymore, because the trend was clear. They're going to reach a point where we can't contain this, the analyst said. Tharic nodded once. They already have. Because containment required boundaries, and those boundaries were gone. The weapons officer stepped forward.
Order, Captain.
The moment hung there. Not tactical, not procedural. Foundational. The Concorde or victory. Tharic looked at the planet one last time, at the billions of lives below, indistinguishable from the systems they now powered, at the war that no longer fit within any structure he understood. And for the first time in his entire career, he hesitated, because the line they wouldn't cross was the line humanity had already erased. Hesitation had never been part of war. Not real war. Under the Concorde, decisions were calculated, verified, and executed within defined parameters. There was no room for uncertainty, because uncertainty led to escalation, and escalation led to extinction. But now, uncertainty was everywhere. Human output has increased another 40%, the sensor officer reported, voice low, controlled only by training. Orbital platforms stabilizing, surface production continuing to expand. Tharic didn't respond immediately. He was watching the shift in deployment patterns. Human assets were no longer just scattered. They were repositioning, deliberately, consistently, into zones the Concorde classified as untouchable. Population centers, dense urban regions, civilian infrastructure. Not as shields, not as strategy, simply because that was where everything already was. They've integrated their entire civilization into the war effort, the analyst said. There are no isolated military targets left. That was the problem. That was the line. The Concorde existed on separation. Remove that, and the system collapsed. We cannot engage without collateral damage, the weapons officer stated. Engagement is no longer compliant. Engagement is no longer possible under current rules, the navigation officer corrected. The distinction mattered, because one implied restraint, the other implied failure. Incoming impacts, the system warned. This wave was different. Not larger, not faster, but tighter. Human fire converged from multiple vectors, overlapping trajectories, compensating for previous interception patterns. More strikes landed. Still minor, still contained, but no longer insignificant. Hull degradation at 7%, the system reported. Silence spread across the bridge. Not because of the damage, because of the trend. They're adapting to our defenses, the analyst said. In real time. They've removed analysis delay completely, Tharic replied, because there was no other explanation. They weren't learning after failure. They were learning during it. Captain, the weapons officer said, more forcefully now, we are approaching unacceptable risk thresholds. We must escalate beyond Concorde limitations. The words were precise, careful, but the meaning was clear. Break the rules. If we do that, the analyst said, we trigger a systemic collapse of the Concorde. It's already collapsing, the navigation officer replied. They've made it irrelevant. Tharic didn't move, didn't speak, because both were true, and neither offered a solution. Incoming transmission, the communications officer said. Surface origin. Tharic nodded once. Play it. The voice returned. No distortion, no urgency, just clarity. We see what you're doing. A pause. You're avoiding cities. Another pause.
You're avoiding us." Silence filled the bridge, because that was exactly what they were doing. "So we're moving everything into them." The projection updated instantly. Massive relocation confirmed. Industrial hubs embedded deeper into population zones. Orbital supply chains rerouted through civilian traffic corridors. Military command distributed across civilian networks.
There was no longer a target that didn't include everything else. "They've eliminated target isolation completely," the analyst said. "We cannot strike without breaking the concord," the weapons officer finished. The transmission continued. "You can keep playing by your rules." A beat. "We're not playing." The signal cut. No escalation, no emotion. Just truth.
"Captain," the navigation officer said, "we are out of options." Tharek's eyes remained fixed on the planet below, on the endless motion, the continuous output, the complete absence of pause. Humanity wasn't forcing a choice between victory and defeat. They were forcing a choice between rules and survival. "Ancient observation fleets are beginning to arrive," the sensor officer added suddenly.
"Multiple signatures at long range. They're watching."
Of course they were. The entire galaxy would be watching. Because what happened next would redefine everything. "If we hold the Concord, we lose," the navigation officer said. "If we break it, we risk total escalation across all civilizations," the analyst countered.
"If we do nothing," the weapons officer added, "they will surpass containment thresholds."
All paths led to collapse. The only difference was how fast. "Captain," the system said quietly, "human output has exceeded containment models." Tharek closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. Not in doubt, in recognition. Because this moment had already been decided. Not by him, by them.
"Prepare a strike authorization," he said.
The bridge froze. Because they all understood what that meant. "Target parameters?" the weapons officer asked, voice lower now. Careful, controlled, waiting. Tharek opened his eyes, looked at the projection one last time, at the billions below, at the systems intertwined so completely that separating them was no longer possible. And then he said it. "Remove targeting restrictions." Silence. Absolute. "Confirm," the weapons officer said, almost mechanically. Tharek didn't hesitate this time. "No protected zones." The words landed like a shockwave across the bridge, because in that moment, the concord of war ceased to exist. "Weapon systems recalibrating," the system announced. "Full spectrum targeting enabled." The projection changed.
For the first time since the conflict began, there were no excluded areas, no safe zones, no boundaries. The entire planet became a target. "Final confirmation required," the system said. Tharek didn't look away. "Execute." The strike came down. Not precise, not limited, not controlled. It hit everywhere. Cities, infrastructure, networks.
Everything that powered the human war effort. Everything that was the human war effort. The impact was immediate, devastating, uncontained. For the first time, humanity stopped. Not completely, not for long, but enough to register, enough to matter. "Surface activity dropping," the sensor officer said. "Output decreasing across all sectors." Silence followed. Heavy. Final. Because they had done it. They had crossed the line no one had crossed in thousands of years. "We've broken them," the navigation officer said quietly. Tharek didn't answer, because he was watching something else. The delay, the gap, the moment between destruction and response. It was longer than before, noticeably longer. But it wasn't empty. It was filling.
Captain, the sensor officer said slowly, we are detecting new signals. Not fewer, not fading, new.
Source? Tharic asked. The answer came back uncertain, for the first time. Everywhere. The projection flickered, then surged, activity returning, not organized, not stable, not efficient, but present. Growing. They're still responding, the analyst said, disbelief breaking through.
After that level of damage,
They didn't stop, Tharic said quietly. Because stopping wasn't something they did. The data continued to rise, slower than before, but rising. Always rising. They're rebuilding, the navigation officer said. From what? The weapons officer asked. No one answered, because the answer didn't matter. They were rebuilding from whatever was left.
Captain, the system said, human activity is increasing. Tharic watched the curve begin again.
Not from zero. Never from zero. Just lower and climbing. We crossed the line, the analyst said, and it didn't end the war. Tharic nodded once, because now he understood. The Concorde hadn't been holding humanity back. It had been holding everyone else safe.
This was the first rule, he said quietly, and it didn't stop them.
The projection surged again, signals multiplying, systems activating, production rising from the ashes of what had just been destroyed. Humanity had been hit with everything the Concorde forbade, and they were still there, still moving, still continuing. And that meant there were no more lines left to cross.
The moment the strike hit, the galaxy saw it. Not as data, not as numbers, as a rupture.
Every observing civilization, every silent fleet at the edge of the system, every intelligence bound to the Concorde, felt it collapse in real time. The first rule had been broken, and nothing followed rules after that. Multiple long-range observers have activated transmissions, the sensor officer reported. They are not encrypted. Tharic didn't need to ask why. Encryption was for order. This was not that. Fragments of communication flooded the channels, different species, different voices, all speaking at once. Confusion, alarm, calculation. They've done it. They broke the Concorde. No, we broke it. Containment protocols? There are no protocols for this.
The noise cut through the bridge like static tearing through structure.
Because this wasn't supposed to happen. Not ever. Filter priority channels, Tharic ordered. The system complied, isolating the clearest signal. A voice emerged, older, colder, carrying authority that did not need to be declared. Confirm strike parameters. Tharic answered immediately. Full spectrum engagement.
No targeting restrictions.
A pause. Not long, but heavy. Then the Concorde is no longer in effect. The words settled like gravity, not as a declaration, as a consequence. Acknowledged, Tharic replied, because there was nothing else to say. The transmission ended. No debate, no resistance, just acceptance. And that was worse than opposition, because it meant everyone understood what came next. Incoming signals increasing, the sensor officer said. Not just observers, active fleets are responding. The projection expanded. Ships across nearby sectors shifting vectors, not toward Earth, but toward each other, toward old borders, old conflicts. They're repositioning, the navigation officer said. Preparing for independent engagements. The Concorde isn't holding them together anymore, the analyst added. There's no reason to restrain. Because restraint required mutual agreement, and that agreement was gone.
"Captain," the weapons officer said, "we need to focus. Human activity is rising again."
Tharic turned back to the primary display. The planet.
The strike had scarred it, visible even from orbit. Entire regions darkened, infrastructure erased, networks shattered. It should have been enough. It should have ended everything. It didn't. Output increasing, the system confirmed. Slower than previous rates, but accelerating. The curve had dropped, but it hadn't flattened. It was climbing again, always climbing. "They're rebuilding," the analyst said, "with reduced resources." "With no pause," Tharic corrected, because that was the difference. Every other civilization would have stopped, assessed, stabilized. Humanity skipped that step. "New signals detected," the sensor officer added. "Origin, surface, multiple independent sources. Fragmented command," the navigation officer said. "They've lost central coordination." "They didn't need it," Tharic said. The transmissions came through, dozens of them, overlapping, unfiltered, raw. Not unified, not controlled, but aligned. "All surviving units, continue operations. Re-establish production in any functional sector. Resource loss irrelevant. Keep moving. No pause. Repeat, no pause." The analyst stared at the feed. "There's no central authority issuing these commands." "There doesn't have to be," Tharic replied. "Because the pattern was embedded, not directed. They've internalized the behavior," the navigation officer said slowly. "Every unit is acting on the same principle. Continue, no matter what." The projection shifted again, new structures rising from damaged regions, improvised systems forming where nothing had existed moments before. Not efficient, not stable, but active, always active. "They're not recovering," the analyst said. "They're advancing from a damaged state." That was worse, because recovery implied returning to baseline. Humanity had no baseline, only forward. "Captain," the sensor officer said, voice tightening, "external fleets are beginning to engage each other." Tharic didn't look away from the planet. "Confirmed," the navigation officer said. "Multiple skirmishes across adjacent sectors. No targeting restrictions observed." It had started, the cascade. One species breaks the rules, and the rest follow. Not because they want to, because they have to. "The conquered is collapsing everywhere," the analyst said. "Simultaneous escalation across multiple civilizations." "Not simultaneous," Tharic said quietly. "Triggered." And the trigger was here. "Human output exceeding post-strike projections," the system added. "Adaptation rate increasing." Of course it was. Because pressure didn't slow them. It accelerated them. "They're learning from the strike," the analyst said. "They're adjusting to total spectrum damage." "They're incorporating it," Tharic corrected. Because it wasn't just adaptation. It was integration. The destruction itself had become part of their process. "Incoming transmission," the communications officer said. "Surface origin." Tharic nodded once. "Play it." The voice that came through was different. Not the same speaker as before, not centralized, but carrying the same clarity. "We saw what you did." A pause. Background noise, chaos, movement, systems struggling to stay operational. "You stopped holding back." Another pause. "So we won't either." Silence stretched across the bridge. Because that was the moment. Not the strike, not the destruction. This, recognition. The transmission continued. "No more limits." A beat. "No more rules." The signal cut. No escalation, no threat. Just alignment. And that was worse than anything else, because now
Both sides were operating the same way. "Captain," the weapons officer said, urgency breaking through, "we've lost the advantage of restraint." Tharic nodded once.
We never had it, because restraint only worked when it was shared.
The projection surged again, human activity rising faster now, new systems forming, new patterns emerging, all accelerating, all refusing to stabilize. "They're reaching pre-strike output levels," the system reported, "faster than expected." Expected no longer mattered. Nothing did.
External conflict spreading, the sensor officer added. Multiple civilizations abandoning Concord protocols.
The galaxy was burning, not from a single war, from all of them. "This is cascading beyond containment," the analyst said. Tharic didn't respond, because containment had already failed. "Captain," the navigation officer said, quieter now, "what do we do?" The question hung there.
Not tactical, not strategic, existential.
Tharic looked at the planet one more time, at the species that had just survived something no civilization was supposed to survive, at the war that had broken not just rules, but the idea of rules itself. And he understood, not completely, but enough. "We continue," he said, because that was the only thing left. The only thing that still made sense. And far below, across a world that refused to stop even when everything told it to, humanity did the same. By the time the fourth cycle began, there was no longer a battlefield. There were no front lines, no defined zones, no clear objectives that could be isolated and measured. The structure that had once made war understandable, predictable, was gone. What remained was movement. Continuous, unbounded, everywhere.
"We've lost all engagement boundaries," the navigation officer said, voice steady but stripped of certainty. "There is no defined theater of conflict." Tharic didn't answer. He was watching the overlays collapse one by one. Maps that once separated military from civilian, strategic from non-strategic, now meaningless. Every layer overlapped.
Every system fed into every other. There was no distinction left to preserve.
"Human output has surpassed pre-strike levels," the sensor officer reported. "Total production capacity now exceeding original baseline by 12%. That shouldn't have been possible. Not after what they had done. Not after the damage inflicted across the entire planet." "They're not rebuilding," the analyst said quietly.
They're expanding from damage.
Because the destruction hadn't reset them. It had redistributed them, forced them into new configurations that, while unstable, were faster, less constrained. "They've removed redundancy constraints," Tharic said. "Everything is now primary." That was dangerous. For any other species, it would lead to collapse. For humanity, it led to acceleration.
Incoming fire, the weapons officer warned.
The next wave hit, not larger, not cleaner, but denser. Impacts spread across the hull in overlapping patterns, not aimed at a single point, but at every point. Distributed pressure, constant stress. "Hull degradation at 15%, the system reported. Silence followed, because the number was no longer minor. It was trending toward consequence.
They're no longer trying to break through, the analyst said. They're trying to wear us down.
They're trying everything, Tharic corrected. Because limiting strategy required choosing. Humanity wasn't choosing. "Captain," the navigation officer said, "external conflicts are escalating rapidly. Multiple systems reporting full-spectrum warfare." The projection expanded. Distant stars flickering with energy signatures, fleets clashing without restraint, entire regions destabilizing under the same pattern now spreading outward. The Concord had not just broken, it had inverted. "They're copying it," the analyst said, Other species are adopting human escalation patterns. They don't have a choice, Tharic replied.
Because if one side abandoned limits, the other side had to follow or lose.
Cascade failure confirmed, the system added. Concord compliance across observed civilizations has dropped below 30%. That number would continue to fall. It always did once the threshold was crossed. We are no longer in a controlled conflict, the weapons officer said. We are in total war. No one corrected them
because there was nothing left to correct.
New human structures detected, the sensor officer said. Location, deep ocean regions. Tharic shifted focus. The projection adjusted, revealing construction beneath the surface, massive, hidden, shielded from orbital detection until now. They moved production below visibility thresholds, the analyst said, after the strike. Of course they had.
Because once they understood vulnerability, they didn't protect it. They relocated it, multiplied it.
Additional sites detected, subterranean, polar regions, atmospheric platforms, the sensor officer continued. They're expanding in all environments. There is no single point of failure, the navigation officer said slowly. There never was, Tharic replied.
That had been the mistake from the beginning, assuming they could be reduced to one.
Incoming transmission, the communications officer said. Surface origin, multiple signals merging. Tharic nodded. Play it. This time the voice wasn't singular. It was layered, multiple speakers, different tones, different regions, but aligned into a single message, not coordinated by command, by intent.
You hit everything. A pause. So we moved everything. Another pause. You escalated. Silence stretched. So we adapted.
The words carried no anger, no fear, just continuation. There's no version of this where we stop. The signal fractured, then ended. Not cleanly, not completely, but enough. They're not communicating to negotiate, the analyst said. They're stating constants.
They're defining the system, Tharic replied,
because that was what this had become. Not a conflict within rules, a system without them. Captain, the weapons officer said, we can continue full-spectrum strikes, increase pressure further, target emerging infrastructure. Tharic didn't answer immediately. He was watching the deeper pattern now, the spread beyond Earth, the way signals extended outward, how human activity was beginning to reach beyond the planet itself again. Not stable, not efficient, but present, growing. They're pushing back into orbit, the sensor officer confirmed, despite losses. They never left, Tharic said, because leaving implied absence. Humanity didn't leave.
They paused, briefly, and then returned.
If this continues, the navigation officer said, they will re-establish off-world capability. They already are, Tharic replied. The projection showed it. New platforms forming, smaller, more distributed, harder to target, built faster than before. Not replacements, evolutions. They're learning from destruction, the analyst said.
Every strike improves their next configuration.
Every strike feeds them, Tharic said quietly. That was the realization. The one that mattered more than any damage metric or output curve. Destruction was not reducing them. It was informing them. And that meant there was no upper limit to their adaptation. Hull degradation at 19%, the system warned. The number climbed, slowly, inevitably.
Captain, the weapons officer said, we cannot sustain this indefinitely. Tharic nodded once. No one can. Not in this kind of war. Not without limits.
External conflicts reaching critical thresholds, the sensor officer added. Multiple civilizations reporting planetary-level engagements. It was spreading. Not just the war, the method. They didn't just break the rules, the analyst said. They replaced them with something else, something simpler. Continue,
always continue. "Captain," the navigation officer said, quieter now, "what is our objective?" The question lingered, because objectives required endpoints, and this didn't have one. Tharic looked at the planet again, scarred, damaged, still burning in places, and still moving, still producing, still reaching outward. "Survival," he said finally. Not victory, not control, just survival. Because that was all that remained. And far below, across a species that had lost everything it was supposed to lose, humanity continued. Not because it was winning, not because it had a plan, but because it had never learned how to stop. By the 9th cycle, the galaxy was no longer observing the war. It was inside it. What began as a contained engagement in a quiet sector had expanded into something without borders, without structure, without restraint. Entire regions burned, not from coordinated campaigns, but from the collapse of agreement. The Concord had not just failed, it had been revealed as fragile, conditional, dependent on a single assumption, that everyone would follow it. Humanity had broken that assumption, and everything built on it followed. Hull integrity at 27%, the system reported. The number no longer caused reaction. It was expected now. Just another curve rising toward consequence. "Human orbital presence has fully reestablished," the sensor officer added. "Distributed platforms, no central control, continuous output." Tharic watched the projection without speaking. The platforms were smaller now, more numerous, harder to track, harder to predict. They didn't resemble anything the galaxy would classify as a fleet. There was no formation, no hierarchy, just presence everywhere. "They've abandoned traditional command structures entirely," the analyst said. "There is no strategic core." "There never needed to be," Tharic replied. Because strategy required stability. Humanity operated without it. "Incoming fire!" the weapons officer warned. The impacts came again, constant, overlapping, relentless. Not designed to break through a single point. Designed to never stop. "They've shifted to persistence over penetration," the analyst said. "They're not trying to win engagements. They're trying to outlast them." "They're trying everything," Tharic said again. Because limiting options required choosing, and they refused to choose. "External conflict status?" he asked. "Escalation continues," the navigation officer replied. "Multiple civilizations have abandoned all restrictions. Planetary destruction events confirmed." The words landed without weight. Because at this point, it was inevitable. "The Concord is no longer referenced in any active engagement," the analyst added. "It's gone. Not officially, not formally, but functionally erased. We're detecting transmissions from multiple civilizations," the communications officer said. "Not directed, open channels." "Play them," Tharic ordered. The bridge filled with fragments. Voices from across the galaxy, no longer coordinated, no longer restrained. "We held the line for centuries. Why are we abandoning it now?" "Because they did. Then we become them, or we lose to them. There was a system, there was order. There was an illusion. The signals overlapped, contradicted, collapsed into noise, because no one had an answer. Not anymore." "Captain," the sensor officer said, "human output has exceeded all projected limits." Tharic didn't react, because projections were meaningless now. "They're not following growth models," the analyst said. "They're not following any model." "They're not modeling," Tharic replied. "They're reacting. Instantly, continuously, without pause, without constraint." "Incoming transmission,"
the communications officer said. "Surface origin, high priority." Tharek nodded once. "Play it." The voice that came through was different again. Not the same as before. Not a leader. Not a command. Just someone. And yet it carried the same clarity. "You finally stopped holding back." A pause. Background noise. Constant, mechanical, alive. It didn't change anything. Silence filled the bridge. Because that was true. You thought that was the line. Another pause. It wasn't. Tharek felt it then. Not fear, not uncertainty. Understanding. There is no line. The words landed heavier than anything else in the war because they didn't describe the conflict. They defined it. You were the only ones who believed there was. The signal ended. Clean. Final. No follow-up. Because nothing else needed to be said. The bridge remained silent. Not because there was nothing happening. Because everything was. "They're right," the analyst said quietly. No one argued. Because there was nothing left to argue. "We built the Concorde to control war," the navigation officer said. "To limit it. To survive it," the weapons officer added. "And they," the analyst began, then stopped. Because the answer didn't fit into any framework they understood. Tharek finished it. "They never tried to control it." That was the difference. The one that mattered. Every other species had treated war as something to be managed, contained, reduced. Humanity treated it as something to be endured, continued, pushed through. "Hull integrity at 31%, the system reported. The number climbed, slowly, relentlessly, just like everything else. "Captain," the navigation officer said, "we cannot sustain this trajectory." Tharek nodded once. "No one can. Not in a war without limits. Not in a system without rules." "Then how are they?" the analyst asked. The question hung there because it wasn't rhetorical. It was real, and it had no answer within the data. Tharek looked at the planet again, at the species that had been classified as low threat, at the war that had broken every assumption the galaxy had ever made about conflict. And he understood. Not completely, but enough. "Because they're not trying to sustain it," he said quietly. "They're just continuing." And that was the difference between survival and victory. "External conflicts reaching maximum escalation," the sensor officer said. "Multiple systems approaching collapse." The galaxy was tearing itself apart, not because of humanity alone, but because of what humanity had revealed. That the rules only worked if everyone agreed to them. And if one species refused, then the rules were never real to begin with. "Captain," the communications officer said, softer now, "there are no more incoming diplomatic channels." Of course there weren't. Diplomacy required structure, agreement, trust, all of which were gone. "Then this is it," the navigation officer said, not as a question, as a realization. Tharek didn't respond immediately. He watched the data one more time, the endless motion, the constant output, the complete absence of pause. Humanity wasn't winning. They weren't losing. They were still there, still moving, still continuing. And in a war without limits, that was enough. "Yes," he said finally, because there was nothing else left to say. The moment had already passed. The one where this could have been controlled. The one where the rules still mattered. Now, there was only continuation. And humanity had already proven they would never stop. There was no final battle, no decisive strike, no moment where one side overcame the other in a single defining act.
That kind of ending required structure, clear objectives, measurable victory conditions, a system both sides understood.
This war had none of those things. It never did. By the 10th cycle, the galaxy had stopped asking who was winning. The question no longer made sense. Entire sectors had gone silent, not because they were destroyed, but because they were still fighting, locked in continuous escalation with no endpoint.
Civilizations that had once measured war in campaigns and outcomes now measured it in survival, hour by hour. Hull integrity at 38%, the system reported. The number should have triggered withdrawal protocols. It should have forced disengagement. Under the Concord, it would have. Under the Concord, none of this would have happened. Human output stable, the sensor officer said. Not increasing, not decreasing.
Theric studied the curve. For the first time since the conflict began, it had flattened. Not collapsed, not slowed, stabilized. They've reached equilibrium, the analyst said, at maximum sustainable chaos. It was an impossible phrase, and yet it fit. Humanity was no longer accelerating. They were no longer adapting at exponential rates. They had found something else. A state where destruction and production balanced, where loss did not reduce capability, because response filled the gap instantly. They're maintaining it, the navigation officer said, continuously. They're living in it, Theric corrected, because this wasn't a phase. It was their new baseline. War without limits, war without pause, war without end. External conflict status? Theric asked.
Multiple civilizations have entered similar states, the sensor officer replied. Not identical, but converging. Of course they were, because there was no alternative. Once the rules were gone, this was what remained. The Concord is no longer referenced in any surviving command structures, the analyst added. It has been erased. Not formally, not ceremonially, but completely.
As if it had never existed.
Incoming transmission, the communications officer said. Source unidentified, not human, not any registered civilization. Tharic turned slightly. Play it. The voice that came through was unfamiliar, old, not in tone, in presence. It carried a weight that didn't come from authority, but from time. We warned them. Silence fell across the bridge. We marked the system. We sealed it. A pause. We knew what would happen if they were awakened. Theric's gaze sharpened, not at the words themselves, but at the implication. You believed war could be controlled. Another pause, longer this time. They never did. The signal held for a moment, as if considering whether to continue. Then, now you understand why we chose to forget them. The transmission ended. No origin trace, no follow-up, just gone. The bridge remained silent, not because of shock, because of clarity. They were sealed, the analyst said slowly. Not to protect themselves, to protect everyone else, the navigation officer finished. Tharic didn't respond. He was watching the planet one last time. Earth. Still scarred, still burning in places, still active, still producing, still reaching outward into space that had once been ordered and was now something else entirely. Human orbital expansion continuing, the sensor officer reported. Slow, distributed, persistent. They weren't trying to conquer, not in the way the galaxy understood conquest. They weren't pushing for territory, for dominance, for control. They were simply continuing. Expanding because they could. Fighting because they were still being fought. Existing within a system that no longer had rules. Captain, the navigation officer said, quieter now. What happens next? The question lingered, not tactical,
not strategic, foundational. Because for the first time, there was no framework to answer it.
Tarek watched the data, the endless motion, the constant exchange of destruction and creation, the balance that wasn't stable but didn't collapse. And he understood. Not everything, but enough. "This doesn't end," he said, not as prediction, as fact, because endings required agreement, and there was none left. "Then what is this?" the analyst asked. Tarek answered without hesitation.
This is what war actually is. Not the controlled version, not the limited one, the real one.
The one that existed before rules, and would exist after them. "And humanity?" the weapons officer asked. Tarek looked at the planet one final time, at the species that had been underestimated, misunderstood, and ultimately uncontained. "They didn't change the war," he said quietly. A pause.
Then the truth that settled over everything. They revealed it. Silence followed. Not empty, just complete. Because there was nothing left to add. The concord of war was gone. Not broken, not defeated, exposed. It had only ever worked because everyone believed in it. Humanity hadn't, and that was enough. Far below, across a world that had survived everything thrown at it and continued without hesitation, the pattern held. Movement, production, adaptation, continuation. Not because they were winning, not because they had a plan, but because they had never needed one. They didn't fight to control war. They fought to endure it. And in a galaxy that had just remembered what war looked like without limits, that made them the only species truly prepared for it.